Welcome, seekers of Middle-earth's deepest mysteries. Today, we embark on a journey into the shadows of Tolkien's legendarium, delving into one of its most enigmatic and controversial subjects, the origins of the Orcs. Were they twisted elves, creations of Morgoth, or something far darker? The answers lie buried in Tolkien's lost notes, hidden within the evolving drafts of the Silmarillion and the history of Middle-earth. What if we told you that even Tolkien himself wrestled with their true origin, never fully settling on a single explanation? Let us unravel this tangled web, decoding the forgotten words of the master himself. To understand where orcs come from, we must begin in the elder days, in the deep years of the First Age. The earliest accounts suggest that orcs were bred by Morgoth in his stronghold of Utumno, twisted from captured elves before the rising of the sun. This version, as stated in the Silmarillion, describes orcs as corruptions of the firstborn, stolen and mutilated in body and spirit, reshaped by Morgoth's dark will. This idea aligns with the great themes of Ardamard, the notion that Morgoth, unlike Eru Ilúvatar, could not create life but only pervert what already existed. But is this truly the final word? As Tolkien refined his mythology, contradictions and uncertainties began to emerge. Later writings in Morgoth's Ring, a volume of the history of Middle-earth, reveal that he struggled with this origin. If elves, beings of deep spirit, were corrupted into mere brutes, would they not still possess some immortal essence? Would an orc, no matter how debased, still experience the fate of the elves, bound to the world until its end? The implications were troubling. This led Tolkien to experiment with new theories, suggesting that orcs could have been bred from men, who were mortal and thus not bound to the same fate. However, this explanation too was flawed. If orcs were once men, they could not have appeared before the awakening of mankind in the year 1 of the First Age. Yet, battles against orcs were recorded long before that, during the time of the Great March of the Elves. In desperation, Tolkien even proposed that orcs might have been constructs of Morgoth, beings without true souls, animated by his own power. But this too was problematic. If they were merely puppets, how could they have independent will or fear, or the capacity for treachery? Things we see throughout The Lord of the Rings. This struggle reveals something profound about Tolkien's creative process. His world was not built in a single stroke, but evolved, layer by layer, shaped by his own shifting philosophy and theological concerns. The more he deepened his legendarium, the more he was forced to reconsider its foundations. If Morgoth could not create life, then where did the orcs truly come from? The answer, perhaps, is that even the greatest storyteller of our time never fully decided. Tolkien's uncertainty over the origins of orcs did not end with the Silmarillion or Morgoth's Ring. In fact, his thoughts continued to evolve well into his later years, as reflected in his private letters and unpublished notes. In a letter written in 1954, he reaffirmed that Morgoth had no power to create real living things of independent will, and that orcs were likely corruptions, not creation. But then, in a later note, he entertained a more metaphysical question. If orcs had no souls of their own, were they merely extensions of Morgoth's own spirit? Mere shadows of his hatred given form? And if so, what happened to them after his fall? The theological implications of this troubled Tolkien deeply. In some of his last reflections, he began to question whether orcs could possess true autonomy at all. He wrote that Morgoth's power was so vast that it bled into the very fabric of Arda, meaning that every orc, every fell creature of darkness, carried a fragment of his malice. If true, this would mean that with Morgoth's defeat, the orcs would not simply scatter or flee, they would decay, like a fire with no more fuel. This concept, though never fully explored in his published works, suggests that orcs were more than mere beasts. They were, in essence, Morgoth's lingering will, twisted reflections of his own rebellion against Ilúvatar. Yet, there was another problem. If orcs were simply manifestations of Morgoth's power, How could they still exist and multiply long after his banishment? How could they serve Sauron, who was merely Morgoth's lieutenant, a lesser being in the cosmic order of Arda? In The War of the Jewels, Tolkien noted that after Morgoth's fall, Sauron had to reassert control over the scattered remnants of Morgoth's creatures, including the Orcs. This suggests that while Morgoth may have been their source, Orcs had gained a terrible independence of their own. If they could be commanded by Sauron, then they were not simply shadows of Morgoth's spirit. They were something more tangible, something far more enduring. This led Tolkien to yet another possibility, one that would have rewritten the very nature of Middle-earth. In some of his latest notes, he speculated that orcs might not have been bred from elves or men at all, but from animals, given a terrible mockery of reason by Morgoth's dark arts. This would explain why they lacked the full spiritual depth of other races, and why their speech and culture were crude, shaped only by brute force and fear. However, this theory clashed with his own earlier writings. It would also have meant that orcs, unlike elves or men, were truly irredeemable, for they were not of Ilúvatar's design, but merely distortions of natural life. These contradictions reveal Tolkien's fundamental struggle. How could he craft a race of beings wholly evil without violating his own moral and theological framework? If orcs were once elves or men, they must have had free will, and with free will comes the potential for redemption. But if they were soulless creatures, then their cruelty was not of their choosing, and they were merely tools of evil rather than participants in it. This paradox haunted Tolkien's writings, leaving the origin of the orcs one of the greatest unresolved mysteries in Middle-earth. As Tolkien wrestled with these contradictions, another unsettling question arose. Could an orc ever be good? If they were corrupted elves or men, did they retain even the faintest glimmer of free will? If so, could an orc reject evil, break free of Sauron's dominion, or even seek redemption? This idea was never fully explored in The Lord of the Rings, where orcs are depicted as wholly malevolent, driven by hatred, cruelty, and fear. Yet, in one late note, Tolkien speculated that it is possible that certain orcs could, in unusual circumstances, renounce evil, though he admitted that such an event would be exceedingly rare. This presents a moral dilemma. If orcs were irredeemable by nature, then Ilúvatar, the supreme creator, would have allowed an entire race to exist solely for suffering and destruction, something that contradicts the deeper moral themes of Tolkien's mythology. But if they had the potential for redemption, then their enslavement under Morgoth and Sauron was all the more tragic. Could an orc, if raised outside the influence of darkness, become something else? If freed from generations of fear and cruelty, could an orc find another path? The idea is tantalizing, but remains largely unexplored in Tolkien's finished works. In The Two Towers, there is a brief exchange between orcs that hints at a more complex society beneath their savagery. When Ugluk, the Uruk Hai, commands his band to march, a smaller orc from Mordor protests, saying, "I'm not going down those elf roads. We're not in Mordor now." The exchange is tense, almost political, showing that even among their kind, orcs had divisions, loyalties, and differing views on power. This suggests that they were not merely mindless beasts, but had some capacity for independent thought. Could it be that their evil was not inherent, but conditioned, a result of centuries of enslavement under Dark Lords? If that is the case, then the true horror of the orcs is not their existence, but their enslavement. A race shaped by fear and bred for war, never given the chance to be anything else. In one of Tolkien's most intriguing late writings, found in The Nature of Middle-earth, he considered yet another possibility, that some orcs might not have been wholly evil, but were instead victims of their own history, bound by an inescapable cycle of violence. This would mean that their nature was not fixed, but that they had simply never been given a chance to be anything but what Morgoth made them. If true, then the corruption of the orcs was not just physical, but spiritual, a race twisted not by its own will, but by the will of its master. Yet Tolkien ultimately left this question unanswered. In his final years, he seemed to lean toward the idea that orcs, being the work of Morgoth, were irredeemable, stating in Morgoth's Ring that they had no spirit of their own and were sustained only by the malice of their creator. This view aligns with the notion that evil cannot create, only corrupt. That Morgoth, in his arrogance, attempted to forge life but could only create hollow imitations, creatures doomed to hatred and suffering. And so, the mystery of the Orcs remains one of the great unanswered questions of Middle-earth, a testament to the complexity of Tolkien's world-building and his own lifelong struggle with the nature of evil. If the Orcs were merely imitations of life, twisted reflections of Ilúvatar's true creations, then what became of them after Sauron's final defeat? Unlike men, whose spirits passed beyond the world, or elves who could seek refuge in Valinor, Orcs had no clear fate. Were they doomed to wander the ruins of Middle-earth, masterless and purposeless, or did they wither away as the last vestiges of Morgoth's will crumbled into nothingness? Tolkien left this question unanswered, but his writings suggest several possibilities. In The Lord of the Rings, after the destruction of the One Ring, the armies of Mordor collapse in disarray. Many Orcs are slain as the land itself turns against them, and others scatter, leaderless and afraid. This aligns with Tolkien's idea in Morgoth's Ring that without the sustaining malice of their master, Orcs might not survive for long. If they were truly the embodiment of Morgoth's corruption, their existence may have been tied to his lingering influence over Arda. With the downfall of Sauron, the last great heir to Morgoth's will, perhaps the Orcs simply began to fade, like a fire that has lost its fuel. Yet, there is another possibility. In some of Tolkien's later writings, he suggested that Middle-earth's fate was not entirely set, that even the darkest creatures might have some role to play in the unfolding history of Arda. If Orcs had any independent will, however faint, then they might have sought survival in the far corners of the world, retreating into the deep places of the earth, dwindling into myths and nightmares, rather than vanishing altogether. This would align with certain myths in the peoples of Middle-earth, which speak of lingering shadows in the wastelands, remnants of Morgoth's old legions that refused to die. But if they survived, could they ever change? Could an Orc freed from the dominion of the Dark Lords forge a new path? There is no clear answer, for Tolkien's own thoughts remained unresolved. In one of his last recorded notes, he considered whether Orcs could ever be tamed or brought into the light of civilization, only to dismiss the idea as unlikely, for their entire existence had been defined by hatred and war. Yet the question remains, was that hatred truly their own? Or was it forced upon them by powers beyond their understanding? And if the latter, then what might have become of them in an age without Dark Lords to command them? The fate of the Orcs is in many ways the final unanswered riddle of Middle-earth. They are the embodiment of Tolkien's greatest philosophical struggle, the nature of evil itself. Were they beyond redemption, mere tools of darkness? Or were they victims of a fate they never chose, doomed to be monsters because the world saw them as such? The truth, as with much of Tolkien's work, is left for us to ponder. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all, that even in the darkest corners of Arda, there remain questions without answers, waiting to be uncovered by those who seek them. And so we reach the end of our journey, though the mystery of the Orcs lingers on, unresolved even by Tolkien himself. In their very existence, they embody the fundamental struggle at the heart of Middle-earth, the eternal battle between light and darkness, creation and corruption, free will and domination. Were they merely extensions of Morgoth's hatred, doomed to perish without him? Or did they possess some fragment of true life, some sliver of autonomy that might have allowed them in another world to escape the shadow of their making? Tolkien never gave a definitive answer, and perhaps that was his intention all along. For Middle-earth is not a world of simple binaries, but of deep complexities, where even the Dark Lord himself was once a being of great light. To fully answer the question of the Orcs would be to impose a rigid finality upon something Tolkien saw as ever-evolving, just as he continuously reworked his legendarium, refining and reshaping his ideas with each new draft. The Orcs remain, then, an enigma, a reflection of Tolkien's own moral and theological uncertainties, his attempt to reconcile his faith with the presence of unredeemable evil in a world created by a benevolent God. Yet, in that ambiguity lies something profound. The unresolved nature of the Orcs forces us, as readers, to engage with the legendarium in a different way, not as passive observers, but as thinkers, as seekers of deeper truth. It challenges us to ask our own questions about the nature of good and evil, about the possibility of redemption, about the unseen consequences of war and enslavement. Just as Tolkien left gaps in his mythology, allowing his world to feel more like a real history than a closed narrative, he left the fate of the Orcs open-ended, an unanswered question that lingers in the mind long after the final page is turned. So what do you believe? Were the Orcs nothing more than echoes of Morgoth's malice, destined to vanish with the Dark Lords? Or could there have been another fate for them, one lost to time, buried in the forgotten pages of Middle-earth's history? The answer, perhaps, is not in the texts themselves, but in the way we interpret them, in the questions we continue to ask. And maybe, just maybe, that is the true magic of Tolkien's world. That it is not merely read, but lived, pondered, and endlessly explored, long after the last words have faded into legend. And with that, our journey through Tolkien's Lost Notes comes to an end. But Middle-earth is vast, and its secrets are endless. Until next time, may your roads be straight and your stars bright. Namari.